farmer humiliated the gardener, but years later he was the only one who could help. Victoria Parker threw the seedlings on the ground with such force that the soil scattered across the cobblestone patio. Her hands trembled with anger as she stomped on each of the plants Harold had so carefully prepared for weeks. That's when he came running from the greenhouse upon hearing the noise. Harold stopped at the garden entrance and saw his employer destroying months of work while shouting words he could barely process. "Incompetent, that's what you are." Victoria pointed her finger at him with bloodshot eyes. "Do you think I'll allow these common plants to ruin my party?" "Mrs. Parker, I don't understand." Harold approached slowly, trying to keep his voice calm. "These seedlings are exactly what you asked for, yellow roses for the front garden." "I asked for imported roses, English roses, like the ones in the Johnsons' farm garden." She kicked another seedling. "Not these wilted things you brought." From the kitchen window, Emily watched the scene with tears streaming down her face. The 15-year-old girl clutched the hem of the apron she wore to help the cook, her fingers gripping the fabric until they turned white. She had known Harold since she was little. He had worked on the farm since before she was born. It was he who taught her to recognize every tree in the orchard, who showed her how to care for plants without hurting them. "Mum, stop it!" Emily opened the window and shouted, but her voice was muffled by the sound of the wind that began to blow stronger. Victoria didn't even look up. She kept stomping on the seedlings while Harold slowly knelt, beginning to collect what remained of the destroyed plants. His large, calloused hands trembled slightly as he picked up each piece of soil, each crumpled leaf. "Get up from there!" Victoria took a step back. "Do you think you have the right to do this in front of me?" "I'm just cleaning up, Mrs. Parker. I don't want anyone to trip." "Trip?" She let out a bitter laugh. "The only thing that will trip here is your incompetence. You understand nothing about beauty, Harold, nothing. How could a man born in the countryside understand what it means to have a real garden?" Harold pressed his lips together. He was 42 years old and had dedicated 20 of them to that farm. His grandfather had worked there before him, and his father too. Oak Ridge Farm was as much a part of his family's history as it was the Parkers. But in recent years, since Victoria's husband had passed away, everything had changed. "I'll get other seedlings, Mum. I'll go to Sacramento if necessary." "You'll do nothing." Victoria crossed her arms. "In fact, you're dismissed today. I don't want to see your face here until Monday. And when you return, I hope you've learned the difference between a common rose and a real rose." Harold stood up slowly, wiping the dirt from his hands on his faded pants. He looked at Victoria for a moment, his brown eyes meeting hers, but said nothing. He just nodded and began walking toward the back of the property, where his small house stood. Emily ran down the stairs, passing by the cook, Mrs. Jenkins, who tried to hold her back. The girl crossed the side garden and reached Harold before he got to the gate. "Mr. Harold, I'm so sorry," she gasped, tears still wetting her face. "My mother isn't well. Since Dad passed, she—" "No need to apologize, Emmy." Harold put his hand on the girl's shoulder. "It's not your fault." "But it's unfair. You do everything right. The garden has never been as beautiful as it is now." Harold smiled sadly. Emily had always been different from her mother. While Victoria cared only about appearances and what the neighbors thought, Emily seemed to have inherited her father's kindness. Dr. Richard Parker had been a good man, who treated all employees with respect. His sudden departure 3 years ago had left a void that Victoria tried to fill with parties and displays of wealth. "Life teaches us to be strong, child," he said softly. "Go inside before your mother sees you here." Emily hesitated but ended up returning home. Harold continued walking along the dirt path that led to his dwelling. The house was simple, just 3 rooms built with exposed bricks. But it was his home, and more importantly, it was where he kept his grandfather's notebooks. Upon entering, he went straight to the small wooden shelf in the corner of the room. There were 3 notebooks covered in old leather, yellowed with time. Inside them, detailed records about the land, the seasons, and planting techniques that had been passed down from generation to generation in his family. His grandfather, Samuel, had been more than just a simple worker. He understood the land in a way that few did. He knew how to read nature's signs, predict droughts and rains, and was familiar with ancient irrigation methods that made water reach where it seemed impossible. Harold had grown up hearing these stories, learning these secrets, but to Victoria, all of this was superstition. When Harold tried to explain about crop rotation, the importance of letting the land rest, or how to collect rainwater using simple techniques, she would laugh. She said these were outdated ideas, that modern agriculture didn't need these old beliefs. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. The following Monday, Harold returned to work carrying seedlings he had obtained from a supplier in Sacramento. They were English roses, exactly as Victoria had requested. He planted them carefully in the front garden, making sure each one was in the perfect position. The party would be in 3 weeks. Victoria had invited the most important families in the area to celebrate Emily's birthday, or at least that's what she said. Harold suspected the real reason was to show that even as a widow, she could still maintain the farm's standard. But while working, Harold noticed something that worried him. The soil was drier than usual for that time of year. November usually brought regular rains, but it had been almost a month without a single drop. The pond at the back of the property was low, and the streams that crossed the farm had reduced in volume. Mrs. Parker. He found her on the porch where she was having breakfast. I need to speak with you about the irrigation. What about the irrigation? Have you noticed it hasn't been raining? We need to save water. I suggest we stop using the automatic sprinklers on the lawn and focus only on essential areas. Victoria set her coffee cup down on the table harder than necessary. Harold, I'm having a party in 3 weeks. Do you think I'm going to let my lawn die? It's not about letting it die, Mom. It's about using water wisely. If we continue like this, we could have serious problems. Serious problems? She stood up. The only serious problem I see here is you trying to tell me how to run my property. My husband may have accepted your suggestions, but I am not him. I know, ma'am. But your husband understood that. Nonsense, Victoria interrupted him. Richard was too kind. He let anyone give their opinion. But I know what I'm doing. Keep irrigating the lawn as you always have. Harold returned to the garden with a heavy heart. He knew he was right, but he couldn't disobey direct orders. In the following days, the situation only worsened. The sky remained clear, without a single cloud. The scorching sun punished the plants, and even with constant irrigation, some began to wilt. Emily tried to help as best she could. She would spend hours beside Harold, learning about the plants, asking questions. But Victoria disapproved. Whenever she saw her daughter in the garden, she called her back inside, saying that wasn't a place for girls from good families. Your grandmother would turn in her grave if she knew you were out in the sun like a common labourer, Victoria would say, ignoring the fact that her own mother had worked hard in the fields before the family prospered. The party finally happened. People came from various nearby towns wearing their best clothes, bringing expensive gifts for Emily. The garden was impeccable, every rose in its place. The lawn green despite the drought beginning to settle in the region. Victoria moved among the guests with a wide smile, showing every corner of the property, talking about the improvements she had made, about her plans to expand coffee production. But as she spoke, Harold watched the horizon with growing concern. The party lasted until late at night. When everyone had left, Victoria was exhausted but satisfied. She had proven her point. She could keep the farm running. She could be respected. She could continue the Parker family tradition. But the next morning when she woke up, something was different. The air had a strange weight, a dry quality that made her throat scratch. She looked out the window and saw Harold already working, but this time he wasn't watering the plants. He was checking the reservoir. Victoria went downstairs and approached him. Why aren't you working? I am working, Mrs. Parker. I'm checking our water reserve. And? It's critical. If it doesn't rain in the next few weeks, we'll have serious problems. You always exaggerate everything, Harold. It's just a passing drought. Every year there's a period without rain. Not like this, ma'am. It's been 6 weeks without a drop. And look at the sky, he pointed upward. Not a single cloud. The winds are hot and dry. This isn't normal. Victoria looked at the sky. It was a deep blue without a single white spot, but she didn't want to admit she was worried. "Keep doing your job. I'll call the water supplier if necessary." 2 weeks later, the situation was undeniable. The drought had settled in brutally. The news reports talked about one of the worst droughts in recent decades. Farms throughout the region were suffering. The state government declared a state of emergency. The reservoir at Oak Ridge Farm was almost dry. The streams had turned into mere trickles of water. The trees began losing leaves out of season, and the pasture was yellowing quickly. The animals needed to be taken to drink in increasingly distant places. Harold sought out Victoria again, this time with a more detailed proposal. "Mrs. Parker, I have a solution. In my grandfather's notebooks, there are old water harvesting techniques. We can build small temporary dams, use handmade drip irrigation methods. We can—" "Enough," Victoria interrupted him, her patience finally worn out. "I'm tired of your stories about your grandfather and his magical notebooks. That's superstition of ignorant people." "It's not superstition, ma'am. They're proven techniques that—" "Proven by whom? By more laborers who never studied anything in their lives." She took a step forward. "I've already called an expert from New York City. A man with a degree, with real knowledge. He'll arrive tomorrow and fix this." "But Mrs. Parker—" "No buts. And you know what, Harold? I'm tired. Tired of your insistence. Tired of your outdated ideas. You're dismissed." Harold felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Dismissed? Fired. You can pack your things. I want you off the property by the end of the week." "But, ma'am, I've worked here for 20 years. My family always—" Your family, Victoria shouted. "Victoria, I'm fed up with hearing about your family. This is my farm, not yours, and if you can't accept my orders, then there's no place for you here." Emily came running from the house. "Mum, what are you doing?" "I'm doing what I should have done months ago. I'm bringing real professionals to take care of this property." "But Harold is a professional. He knows this land better than anyone." "Go to your room, Emily. This is none of your business." "Yes, it is. This farm is my inheritance too. And you're destroying everything Dad built." Victoria turned pale. For a moment, it seemed like she was going to say something, but then just turned around and went into the house, slamming the door. Harold put his hand on Emily's shoulder. "It's all right, girl. Everything will be all right." "No, it won't. How can everything be all right when she's sending you away?" "Because life goes on. And you need to take care of your mother. She's suffering even if she doesn't show it." In the following days, Harold packed his things. His belongings fit into a few boxes. Clothes, tools, his grandfather's notebooks. He took one last look at the house where he had lived for so many years, at the garden he had helped create, at the land he knew so well. When he went to collect his payment, Victoria was in the office with a man in a suit. It must have been that specialist from New York City. "Oh, Harold," she didn't even look at him. "I left your payment there on the table." Harold picked up the envelope. It was very light. When he opened it, he saw there was only money for 2 weeks of work. "Mrs. Parker, there's only 2 weeks' pay here. But I worked the whole month and I still have accumulated vacation time. You were let go for incompetence. You're not entitled to anything beyond what's there." "But ma'am, that's not right. The law says I can fire anyone I want from my property. If you're not satisfied, get a lawyer." "Oh, wait." She finally looked at him with a cruel smile. "You don't have money for a lawyer, do you?" Harold clenched the envelope in his hand. He could argue, he could fight for his rights, but looking at Victoria, he realized it would be useless. She was determined to humiliate him to the end. "All right, Mrs. Parker. I hope you find what you're looking for." He left the office and the farm for the last time. Emily ran to say goodbye, crying so hard she could barely speak. Harold hugged her and whispered in her ear, "When you need me, you know where to find me." Harold returned to the small town of St. Joseph's Grove, where he was born. There he lived in a small house that had belonged to his parents. It was even simpler than the house on the farm, but it was his. And in the back, there was a small plot where he could plant. The first few weeks were tough. The money Victoria had given him barely covered basic expenses. But Harold wasn't one to give up. He started offering his services to the neighbors, small gardening jobs, tree pruning, simple things that gave him enough to get by. It was then that Mrs. Carman, a 70-year-old lady who lived 3 houses down, came to him. "Harold, my son, I heard you know about plants." "I do, Mrs. Carman. How can I help?" "It's my vegetable garden. Nothing is growing. I try to water it, but the water seems to disappear into the dry soil, and the plants stay wilted." Harold went to her house and examined the plot. The soil was indeed very dry and compacted, but he had seen this before. He opened one of his grandfather's notebooks and showed Mrs. Carman simple drawings of a drip irrigation system made with basic materials. "We can do this with plastic bottles and some old hoses. It'll get the water straight to the roots without wasting it." "And it really works?" "It works. My grandfather used similar techniques when he didn't even have plastic. He used bamboo and clay. They spent the afternoon setting up the system. Harold taught Mrs. Carman how to position the bottles, make holes of the right size, and create small channels in the soil to direct the water. Within a week, her vegetable garden was transformed. The plants began to grow again. The tomatoes turned red and shiny, and the lettuces were green and lush. The news spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Soon, Harold was being called by several people. Old Anthony wanted help with his fruit trees. Mrs. Lucy needed to revive her garden. The young couple who had just bought a small farm wanted to learn how to plant. Harold didn't charge much. Sometimes he accepted just a meal as payment. But in every place he worked, he left behind the techniques he taught. He showed how to compost with food scraps, create mulch to protect the soil, and collect rainwater even when it rained little. And the drought continued. It was completely abnormal now. Meteorologists talked about climate change, about altered rainfall patterns. Large farms were losing entire crops. Cattle were being sold for a song because there was no pasture. But the small properties where Harold had worked were holding on, not thriving, but surviving. The ancestral techniques he applied made the difference between losing everything and maintaining some production. Meanwhile, at Oak Ridge Farm, the situation was desperate. The specialist from New York City had implemented an expensive irrigation system that consumed even more water. He had convinced Victoria to invest in powerful chemical fertilizers that, according to him, would make the plants grow even in the drought. But the result was the opposite. The chemicals, combined with the lack of water, ended up poisoning the soil. The plants not only didn't grow, but began to die. The coffee, the farm's main product, was in critical condition. The trees were losing leaves rapidly and many simply dried up. Victoria spent a fortune trying to reverse the situation. She called in more specialists, bought more products, drilled deeper wells, but nothing worked. With each passing month, the situation worsened, and the money ran out. Emily, who was now 18, tried to help. But every time she suggested something, Victoria told her to shut up. The relationship between mother and daughter was completely worn out. They barely spoke, living in the same house like strangers. It was then that Emily made a decision. She had been accepted into a university in Davis to study agronomy. When she told her mother, she expected some reaction, but Victoria just nodded, distracted by the farm's accounts. "Do whatever you want," was all she said. Emily left home heartbroken. She loved that farm, loved every tree, every corner, but she could no longer stay and watch everything fall apart while her mother refused to listen to any advice. The years passed. Emily devoted herself to her studies with determination. She excelled in university, especially in subjects related to sustainable agriculture and water resource management in scarcity situations. Her professors praised her ability to combine technical knowledge with a practical understanding of the land. During this time, she maintained sporadic contact with her mother, short phone calls, quick visits during holidays. Each time she returned, the farm was worse. The garden that Harold had tended with such care was dead. The crops were mere shadows of what they had been. The big house began to show signs of neglect. Victoria had sold almost everything of value. Family jewelry, antique furniture, even some of the best paintings. All to keep up appearances, to pretend she was still the powerful farm owner everyone respected. But people knew. The comments in town were cruel. They said she had ruined in a few years what generations of Parkers had taken decades to build. Harold, on the other hand, had grown professionally. His reputation as a sustainable irrigation consultant had spread throughout the region. Small farmers called on him to teach survival techniques during droughts. He had bought a small plot of land and turned it into a living example of sustainable agriculture. On his land of just 2 hectares, Harold cultivated an incredible variety of plants. He had a vegetable garden, an orchard, even a small chicken coop. Everything worked in harmony, using techniques his grandfather had taught him and that he had perfected through study and observation. He created rainwater harvesting systems using modified tiles and simple cisterns. He implemented strategic shading to reduce evaporation. He used native plants that attracted beneficial insects and helped keep the soil fertile. His property was an oasis amid the drought that still plagued the region. One afternoon, Harold received a visit from a group of students from a nearby university. They wanted to learn about his techniques, understand how he managed to produce so much in such a small space, with so few resources. Among the students was Emily. She had grown up, was 22 now, about to graduate. When Harold saw her, he hardly recognized her. The shy girl had transformed into a confident young woman, with eyes shining with purpose. "Mr. Harold," she ran to hug him. "Emmy, my goodness, how you've grown." They talked for hours. Emily wanted to know everything. What techniques he used, how he had developed those systems, if he still had his grandfather's notebooks. Harold showed everything with pride, happy to see that the girl who once cried for him at the window was now a budding agronomist. "How is your mother?" he asked, knowing the answer probably wouldn't be good. Emily sighed. "I don't know, Mr. Harold. I haven't spoken to her in months. The last time I called, she hung up on me." "Is she still at the farm?" "She is, but barely surviving. I heard the bank is threatening to take everything." Harold shook his head sadly. He didn't feel anger toward Victoria. He felt sorry for her. She had let pride and stubbornness destroy everything she had. "And you? Any plans after graduation?" "Yes. I want to work with family farming, help small producers, just like you do." "It's a beautiful path, girl. But remember, there will be many people who won't want to listen. Many who will prefer expensive and complicated solutions over simple ones that work. I know, I learned by watching my mother. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. 2 months after graduating, Emily received a phone call that would change everything. It was Mrs. Jenkins, the former cook at the farm, who still worked there out of pure loyalty. "Emily, you need to come. It's urgent." "What happened, Mrs. Jenkins?" "It's your mother, dear. The bank, and they're going to take the farm. She has 6 months to make the land produce enough to pay off at least part of the debt, otherwise we'll lose everything." Emily felt her heart tighten. As hurt as she was with her mother, that farm was her history. It was where she was born, where she grew up, where her father was buried in the small family cemetery. She took the first bus home. When she arrived, she barely recognized the place. The gates were rusty, the driveway full of weeds, the house needed painting. It looked like an abandoned property, not the proud Oak Ridge farm. Victoria was on the porch, sitting in an old chair, staring into space. When she saw Emily, her face showed no emotion. "So you're back," was all she said. "Mrs. Jenkins called me, told me about the situation." "And what are you going to do? Laugh in my face? Say you were right?" "No, Mother. I'm going to try to help." Victoria let out a bitter laugh. "Help? How? You're a recent graduate with no experience. What can you do that experts couldn't?" Emily took a deep breath, controlling the anger that was beginning to rise. "I can try, with knowledge I've learned and with help from someone who truly understands this land." "If you're talking about that Harold, forget it. I'll never ask him for help." "Then you'll lose everything." The 2 women stared at each other. Victoria was the first to look away. In the following days, Emily assessed the situation. It was worse than she had imagined. The soil was completely degraded from years of improper chemical use. The water was contaminated. The few coffee trees still alive were sick. The infrastructure was in ruins. She did the math. To recover it in 6 months would require a miracle, or someone with very specific knowledge about that land, someone who knew every corner, every characteristic of the soil, every possible water source, someone like Harold. Emily went to St. Joseph's Grove without telling her mother. When she arrived at Harold's property, she was impressed again. In just a few years, he had transformed it into a true model of sustainability. There were even some people working with him, learning his techniques. "Mr. Harold, I need to talk to you." They sat under the shade of a mango tree that bore fruit even in that drought. "It's about the farm, isn't it?" Harold already knew. "Yes. My mother will lose everything if she can't make the land produce in 6 months, and I don't know if I can do it alone. I need help." Harold remained silent for a long time, looking at his calloused hands. "Emily, I understand your situation, but you know your mother will never accept my help. She doesn't have to accept it. She just needs to not refuse it. And what's the difference? The difference is that I'll be there. I can be the bridge between you. I'll implement the techniques, say they're mine, that I learned them in college. She doesn't need to know it's your knowledge. That would be dishonest, girl. And letting my mother lose everything would be fair." Harold sighed. He knew Emily was right, but he also knew Victoria needed to learn a lesson. She couldn't be saved without understanding what she had done wrong. "I'll help you," he finally said, "but on one condition. When the time is right, your mother needs to know the truth. She needs to know where the help came from. When she finds out, she might refuse everything. That's the risk, but it's the right way to do things." Emily agreed. In the following weeks, Harold visited the farm secretly. He went at dawn when Victoria was still sleeping and analyzed the soil, tested the water, examined the plants that still survived. He made detailed notes and passed everything to Emily. The diagnosis was grim. The soil was poisoned by years of excessive use of chemical fertilizers that Victoria had insisted on applying. The land was too acidic, without microbial life, compacted. It was almost like cement. "This will take years to recover, Emily, not 6 months." "There has to be a way, Mr. Harold, there has to be." Harold thought for days. He consulted his notebooks, did calculations, considered every possibility. And then he had an idea. It was risky, required intensive work, but it could work. "We're not going to recover the whole farm," he explained to Emily. "That would be impossible. But we can recover a part, 1 hectare, maybe 2. Using intensive composting techniques, doing rapid crop rotation that helps loosen and nourish the soil, implementing efficient irrigation systems." "And would that be enough to convince the bank?" "If we can make those 2 hectares produce well, showing there's recovery potential, maybe yes. Banks like to see concrete results." Emily hugged Harold tightly. "Thank you, Mr. Harold. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet. The work will be hard and you'll need more people." That's when something surprising happened. When the people from St. Joseph's Grove learned that Harold was helping restore Oak Ridge Farm, many volunteered to help. They were the same neighbors whose properties Harold had saved during the drought. Mrs. Carmen, old Anthony, Mrs. Lucy, the young couple from the small farm, and many others. "We owe you a great deal, Harold," said old Anthony. "If it weren't for your techniques, we would have lost everything. Now it's time to repay you." But when Victoria learned there would be volunteer workers coming to help, she became suspicious. "Why would these people come work for free on my farm?" "Because they know we're in trouble, Mother. Because there's still kindness in the world." "Kindness," Victoria repeated the word bitterly. "Nobody does anything for free. They must want something. They don't want anything. They just want to help." Victoria didn't believe it, but she was too desperate to refuse. She watched from the window as groups of people arrived on weekends, bringing tools, materials, and willingness to work. She saw when they began marking out a specific area of the farm, turning the soil, bringing cartloads of compost. Emily coordinated everything, following to the letter the instructions Harold gave. They started by applying lime to correct the soil's acidity. Then came tons of organic compost, made with manure, plant residues, sawdust. The hard ground began to soften, to come alive again. They first planted cover crops, plants that grew fast and helped loosen the soil with their roots. Pigeon peas, sun hemp, velvet beans. In a few weeks, that area began to turn green again. Victoria watched everything with a mix of hope and suspicion. How were these simple people, using techniques that seemed so basic, achieving what expensive experts couldn't? One afternoon she came down from the house and went to where Emily was working. "Where did you learn all this?" Emily hesitated. She had promised Harold she would tell the truth when the time came, but it still didn't seem like the right moment. "In college, Mother. I learned about regenerative agriculture, about how to restore degraded soils. And these people? How do they know exactly what to do?" "I teach them, and they learn fast." Victoria looked at her daughter for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time in years. "You've become a strong woman, Emily. Your father would be proud." It was the first time in years that Victoria had mentioned her husband without bitterness. Emily felt tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Mother." The work continued. After the cover crops, they began planting short-cycle vegetables, lettuce, arugula, radish, chives, products that could be harvested in a few weeks and sold at local markets. It wasn't the coffee that had always been the farm's pride, but it was income. Harold had planned everything carefully. While the vegetables grew, they also planted coffee seedlings in a smaller area, using organic fertilization and shading techniques. There wouldn't be a harvest for 6 months, but it would prove that the farm could produce coffee again in the future. And the water. Harold had created an ingenious system for collection and reuse. Every drop of water was used to the maximum. They built small temporary dams, cisterns to collect rainwater, and implemented drip irrigation throughout the recovered area. When rain finally came, after months of drought, it was a celebration. The water filled the cisterns, fed the dams, refreshed the land, and the system they had created worked perfectly. Not a single drop was wasted. The first vegetable harvest was modest, but significant. Emily took the produce to the town market and sold everything in a few hours. People were talking about the exceptional quality, about the intense flavor. It was the result of healthy soil and proper cultivation techniques. With the money from the sales, Emily bought more seeds, more materials. The cycle began to sustain itself. Every week there was a new harvest, new sales, new reinvestment. Victoria still watched from afar, but now with less suspicion and more curiosity. She began to ask questions, wanting to understand how it was working. Emily explained patiently, but always omitting Harold's name. It was Mrs. Jenkins who, unintentionally, almost ruined everything. "Mrs. Parker, it's impressive how Harold's techniques are working so well." Victoria froze. "What did you say?" Mrs. Jenkins realized her mistake, but it was too late. I meant, is Harold involved in this?" Victoria looked at Emily with furious eyes. "Did you bring him here?" "Mom, let me explain." "No, I don't want to hear it." Victoria was shaking with anger. "I knew there was something strange. I knew you couldn't have learned all this on your own. I did learn it, but old Harold helped me adapt the knowledge for this specific land. He knows every inch of this farm. He hasn't set foot here in years. How could he know? Because he came, Mom. He came in the early morning when you were sleeping to analyze the soil, test the water, see what needed to be done. He did it without charging anything, moved only by the kindness of his heart." Victoria fell silent, processing that information. "So all this was charity? Pity for what's left of the farm?" Her voice was heavy with humiliation. "It wasn't pity, Mum, it was justice. It was doing what's right even after everything you did to him." "What did I do? I just fired an incompetent employee." "Incompetent?" Emily was now equally furious. "He tried to warn you about the drought. He tried to teach you techniques that would have saved everything. But you preferred to listen to expensive experts who only made things worse." "Get out of my sight," Victoria said, her voice dangerously low. "Mom, get out!" Emily left, but not far. She knew this confrontation had to happen at some point. Maybe it was even better this way, everything out in the open. In the following days, Victoria shut herself in the house. She didn't go out, didn't talk to anyone. The volunteers kept coming to work, but they felt the weight of that tension in the air. Some asked Emily if everything was okay, if they should continue. She always said yes, to keep going. It was old Anthony who had the idea to confront Victoria directly. "Mrs. Parker." He knocked on the house door on the 4th day of her isolation. "We need to talk." Victoria opened the door, her face showing signs of sleepless nights. "What do you want?" "I want you to listen to what I have to say. And more importantly, I want you to hear what this whole community has to say. I don't need to hear anything from anyone." "Yes, you do, because you're throwing away the only chance to save your farm out of pure pride." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. The following Saturday, old Anthony gathered all the volunteers in the recovered area of the farm. There were almost 50 people there. Some were small farmers, others were townspeople who had helped on weekends. Everyone had a story to tell about Harold. Old Anthony went to the house and knocked on the door again. This time he wasn't alone, he was with Emily. "Mrs. Parker, please come down and listen to these people. If after that you still want everyone to leave, we will. But give us this chance." Victoria appeared on the porch. She looked at the crowd gathered on her property and felt something strange. It wasn't anger, it was something closer to shame. Mrs. Carmen was the first to speak. "Mrs. Parker, my name is Carmela. You don't know me, but I know your farm. I passed by here a few times when I was younger, when your husband was still alive. I always thought this was the most beautiful place in the region." Victoria said nothing, just listened. "A few years ago, when the drought started, I thought I would lose my vegetable garden. It was a small thing, I know, but it was what fed me. It was Harold who saved me. He taught me simple techniques that cost almost nothing, but made all the difference. One by one, people began to tell their stories. The young couple who had managed to make their small farm produce, Mrs. Lucy, who saved her fruit trees, old Peter, who managed to keep his chickens even with the scarce water. Each story was about someone Harold had selflessly helped. "He never charged anyone," said old Anthony. "Sometimes he wouldn't even accept payment. He said knowledge had to be shared, not hoarded." "And now we're here," continued Mrs. Carmen, "because we want to give back. But it's not just for him. It's for Emily too, who's always been a good girl. And it's for your farm, Mrs. Parker, because this place is part of our region's history." Victoria felt tears beginning to stream down her face. She tried to wipe them away, ashamed to cry in front of strangers, but couldn't stop. "I was terrible to him." Her voice came out as a whisper. "So terrible." Emily climbed the steps and stood beside her mother. "You were, Mom, but you can change that now." "How? How can I change what's already done?" "Start with the basics, acknowledging the mistake, apologizing." "He's not even here." "But he could be, if you want." Victoria looked at her daughter, then at all those people on her property, people who had come from far away, who had donated their time, their strength just out of kindness. And then she looked at the area they had restored, green, vibrant, alive, a stark contrast to the rest of the dead farm. "All right," she finally said. "Call Harold. I need to talk to him." Harold arrived the next day. He came in his old pickup truck, driving slowly up the driveway, as if revisiting every memory of that place. When he stopped in front of the main house, he sat for a moment, just looking. Victoria was on the porch, waiting. When Harold got out of the car, the two stared at each other for the first time in years. He had aged, had more wrinkles around his eyes, some grey hairs, but he was still the same man as always, steady, serene. "Mrs. Parker," he greeted, taking off his cap. "Harold." She descended the steps slowly. "I don't know where to start." "Then don't start. Let's just look at the land." They walked together through the restored area. Harold pointed out details, explained choices he had guided Emily to make. Victoria listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in her life when it came to Harold. "How did you know?" she finally asked. "How did you know exactly what was wrong with the soil? Because I knew this land before it got sick. Remember how it was when your husband was alive? How everything grew easily, how the plants were strong. I remember. That's because he respected the land. He didn't force it. He didn't try to make it produce more than it could naturally give. He used techniques that worked with nature, not against it. And I destroyed all that. You didn't destroy it, Mrs. Parker. You just hurt it. The land has an incredible ability to recover when we let it and help it the right way. They reached the small family cemetery, where Dr. Richard was buried. Victoria hadn't been there in months, maybe years. She couldn't bear to face her husband's grave and admit how she had failed to maintain his legacy. "He would be disappointed in me," she said, her voice breaking. "He would. But he would also be proud of Emily. She's exactly like he was. Good, fair, smart." Victoria looked at Harold with tears in her eyes. "I need to apologize, not just for firing you, but for everything, for humiliating you, for destroying your plants, for not paying you what you were owed, for spreading lies about you." "Lies?" "After you left, I told people you had stolen ideas and even some tools. I wanted to justify why I had sent you away. I wanted people to think I was right." Harold closed his eyes for a moment. That explained many things. It explained why some experts he tried to contact in the first months never returned his calls. It explained the strange looks he had received on some occasions. "That was cruel, Mrs. Parker." "I know. I have no excuse. Just pride and spite." They remained silent for a long time, just listening to the wind pass through the trees that were still alive. "And now?" Harold finally asked. "What do you want from me?" "Help. I know I don't deserve it. I know I have no right to ask. But I'm asking anyway. Not for me, but for Emily. This farm is hers too. It's the inheritance her father left. I'm already helping. Through Emily. I know, but I need more. I need you to teach me. I need to understand what I did wrong so I never repeat it." Harold looked at her with surprise. That proud woman who had always refused to listen to his advice was now asking to be taught. "Are you sure? Because it won't be easy. You'll need to work hard, get your hands dirty, do things you've always looked down on. I know, and I'm ready." In the following months, Victoria transformed. She woke up early and went to the planting area, working side by side with the volunteers. Her soft hands, which had never done heavy work, began to develop blisters. But she didn't complain, she just kept going. Harold taught her with patience. He showed her how to read the signs of the land, how to understand when a plant needed more water or less sun. He explained about natural cycles, about the importance of working with the seasons and not against them. "Look here." He showed her a coffee plant they had planted. "The leaves are slightly yellow at the tips. What does that mean?" "That it needs more water?" Victoria guessed. "No, it means there's too much nitrogen. We need to balance it with other plants that fix less nitrogen in the soil." Each day, Victoria learned something new, and each day she felt more ashamed of how she had treated Harold. That knowledge she had dismissed as superstition of ignorant people was actually the result of generations of careful observation and respect for nature. Emily watched her mother's transformation with a mix of pride and relief. Finally, after so many years, she saw the woman her mother could have been, the woman who might have been hidden under layers of grief, pride, and fear. But not everything was coming up roses. The farm's recovery was progressing, but it still wasn't enough to convince the bank. The manager had come to visit, and although impressed with the work, said he needed to see more concrete results. "You have 3 months," he said. "Show that you can make at least 5 hectares produce profitably, or I'll have to proceed with the foreclosure." 5 hectares in 3 months. It was double what they had recovered so far, and that had taken 4 months. It seemed impossible. That night, Harold, Emily, and Victoria sat down to do the math. Even working day and night, even with all the volunteers helping, they couldn't do it. It was mathematically impossible. "Unless?" Harold began, but stopped. "But unless what?" Victoria asked. "Unless we have more manpower, much more. But from where? We've already exhausted all possible volunteers. People have their own lives, their own lands to care for." "I have an idea," Harold said slowly. "But you won't like it, ma'am. At this point, I'm willing to hear anything. We need to ask for public help. Organize a regional volunteer effort. Explain the situation. Ask people to come, even if just for a day. But for that, you'll have to do something difficult. What? You'll have to tell your story, all of it. The mistakes, the arrogance, the fall, the struggle to recover. You'll have to be completely honest with people who've known you for decades, who saw you at your peak, who know your reputation. Victoria paled. The idea of publicly exposing her flaws was terrifying. She had spent years building an image of a strong, successful woman. Admitting faults would completely destroy that image. Isn't there another way? Her voice came out small. There is. We can try alone and probably fail, or we can ask for help and have a real chance. Victoria looked at Emily, who held her hand. Mom, you don't need to keep up appearances. Not anymore. People will respect you more for your honesty than for any facade you try to maintain. You think so? I'm sure of it. That was how, a week later, Victoria Parker was in the community hall of St. Joseph's Grove, facing nearly 200 people, farmers, merchants, townspeople and neighbors, all curious to know why the proud farm owner had called this meeting. Victoria looked at that sea of faces and felt her legs tremble. But then she saw Emily and Harold at the back of the room, waving encouragingly, and took a deep breath. Good evening, everyone. My name is Victoria Parker and I've made many mistakes. She told everything. About how she had treated Harold unfairly, about how she had ignored warnings about the drought, about the expensive experts who only made things worse, about the debts, the imminent loss of the farm, the desperation. I hurt many people with my arrogance, she continued, her voice trembling. I fired workers without paying what I owed, spread lies about Harold to protect my ego, blocked community projects like the well many here wanted to build because I thought I knew better than everyone. A murmur went through the room. Some people shook their heads, remembering their own negative experiences with Victoria. I don't deserve forgiveness, I know that, but I'm here, humbling myself before all of you, because I learned an important lesson. I learned that when we act with pride, we destroy not only ourselves but everyone around us. And I learned that the only way to rebuild is with humility and honest work. She explained about the bank's deadline, about the 5 acres that needed recovering in 3 months. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm asking anyway. Not for me, but for my daughter, who deserves to have her father's inheritance. Not for the farm itself, but for what it can become. A place of learning, of sharing knowledge, an example of how it's possible to recover what was lost. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Victoria returned to her seat beside Emily, certain she had failed, that her honesty had come too late. That was when an elderly woman stood up. Victoria recognized her. It was Miss Betty, one of the most respected farmers in the region. A woman Victoria had offended years ago by saying her traditional techniques were outdated. Mrs. Parker, Miss Betty began, her voice strong despite her 80-some years. You hurt me deeply 5 years ago. You laughed in my face when I tried to explain about natural composting, said I was an old-fashioned woman who knew nothing about modern agriculture. Victoria lowered her eyes, shame burning her face. But, Miss Betty continued, I've learned in my long life that everyone deserves a second chance. Especially when that person has the courage to admit their mistakes. I will help. Others began to stand up, one by one at first, then in groups, men and women, young and old. Within 15 minutes, over 100 people had committed to helping with the community effort. Victoria began to cry, not from sadness, but from gratitude and relief. She had prepared herself to be rejected, to be publicly humiliated as payback for her past actions. Instead, she was receiving compassion. Harold approached her at the end of the meeting. See, people are better than we think. They just need honesty. How can you not hate me? Victoria asked. After everything I did? Because hatred is a burden I don't want to carry, and because you're trying to be better. That counts for a lot. Over the next 3 months, Oak Ridge Farm transformed into a living construction site. Every weekend, dozens of people arrived to help. They worked from sunrise to sunset, turning soil, planting, building irrigation systems, preparing compost. Miss Betty brought her traditional composting techniques and taught everyone. Her method was simple but effective, turning plant scraps and manure into rich fertilizer in just a few months. She and Harold worked side by side, combining ancestral knowledge with modern techniques that Emily had learned in college. The young couple from the small farm had developed an interesting crop rotation system that maximized production. They taught this method to the others. Old Peter shared his integrated farming techniques, showing how chickens could help control pests and fertilize the soil at the same time. It was a beautiful exchange of knowledge. Each person brought something unique, and everyone learned from each other. The farm was becoming not just productive, but also a learning center. Victoria worked harder than anyone. Her hands, once soft and well cared for, were now calloused and marked by working the land. Her back ached at the end of the day. She had blisters that popped and formed again. But she didn't stop. One afternoon, while planting coffee seedlings under the hot sun, Victoria fainted. The heat, the physical effort, her age, it all took its toll. When she woke up, she was in the shade, with Harold holding a glass of water and Emily by her side with a damp cloth on her forehead. "Mum, you need to rest. You're not young anymore." "I can't rest. There's too much work." "And there will still be work tomorrow and the day after," Harold said firmly. "But if you work yourself to death, you won't be here to see the results." Victoria drank the water slowly, still dizzy. "Harold, can I ask you a personal question?" "Go ahead. Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me after everything?" Harold remained silent for a moment, looking at the fields being restored. "Because it's not about you, Mrs. Parker. It never was. It's about this land. It's about preserving knowledge. It's about proving that it's possible to recover what was lost. And yes, it's about Emily too. She deserves a chance. And I don't deserve one? Everyone deserves a chance to start over, but only when they recognize they need to start over. It took time, but you got there." The weeks passed quickly. The community effort was working beyond expectations. They not only restored 5 acres, but reached 6. And they didn't just restore them, they transformed them. Those areas were producing exceptionally high-quality vegetables, had fruit trees beginning to bear fruit, and coffee seedlings growing strong and healthy. Emily had created a direct sales system. She took the products to markets in various cities and established partnerships with restaurants that wanted organic ingredients. Money started coming in more consistently, but it still wasn't enough. When the bank manager came for the final inspection, he was impressed with the progress, but the numbers were inflexible. "You've done incredible work," he said, walking through the restored fields. "Truly impressive. But the debt is large, very large. Even with this production, it'll take you years to pay it off." "But we're producing," Emily argued. "We're showing that the farm is viable." "I understand, and I'll take that into consideration, but it doesn't depend solely on me. There's a board, there are rules. I'll try to negotiate a longer term, but I can't promise anything." That night, Victoria, Emily, and Harold sat on the house porch, exhausted and discouraged. They had worked so hard, achieved so much, but it still might not be enough. "There has to be a solution," Emily said. "There has to be. Unless we find another source of income," Harold thought aloud, "something that generates money faster than regular product sales." That's when Victoria had an idea. "What if we turned part of the farm into a school?" "A school?" Emily looked at her, confused. "A sustainable techniques school. We charge for courses, teach everything we've learned here. There are so many people interested in learning sustainable agriculture. And we have Harold, we have Miss Betty, we have you with your academic knowledge. We could teach theory and practice." Harold leaned forward, interested. "That could work. There are government programs that support this type of initiative. We could seek funding." "And it wouldn't just be about money," Emily added, excited. "It would be about spreading knowledge, helping more people avoid making the same mistakes we did." They worked all night planning. They would hold weekend courses on composting, sustainable irrigation, and degraded soil recovery. They would have theoretical and practical modules. They would offer scholarships to small farmers who couldn't afford it. The next morning, Emily started writing the project. She had contacts from college, professors who could help legitimize the initiative. Harold knew experienced agronomists who could come as visiting instructors. The project was submitted to several entities: universities, farmers' associations, even some government programs supporting family farming. And to everyone's surprise, they started receiving positive responses. A university wanted to partner, sending students for internships. An organic farmers' association wanted to use the farm as a regional training center. And a state program approved initial funding to help set up the infrastructure. But the best surprise came from where they least expected it. Miss Betty appeared at the farm with a group of other elderly women farmers. "Victoria," she said, her voice firm, "we talked and decided to invest in your school. It's not much, but it's what we've saved. We want to be partners." Victoria was speechless. Those women whom she had underestimated for years were offering their savings to help her. "But why? Why would you do this?" "Because this knowledge is dying," said one of the women, Mrs. Josephine. "Our children don't want to learn. They think it's old people's stuff. But if we have a real formal school, maybe they'll listen, maybe they'll learn." "And because," added Miss Betty, "you had the courage to change. If you managed, there's hope for everyone." The school was named the Dr. Richard Parker Sustainable Agriculture Center in honor of Victoria's late husband. Classes started modestly with only 15 students, but word spread quickly. The quality of teaching, the combination of theory and practice, the instructor's knowledge, everything was impressive. Within 6 months they had a waiting list. Students came from other regions, even from other states. The farm became a reference. Articles were written about the property's recovery. TV programs wanted to do stories. And money started coming in. Not much at first, but enough to gradually pay off the debts. The bank, seeing the project's viability, agreed to renegotiate with longer terms and lower interest rates. But not everything was celebrations. One day, during a practical lesson on irrigation, Harold had to tell a story he had kept for years. "Do you know why I know this land so well?" he asked the students gathered around him. Everyone waited in silence. "Because my grandfather, Samuel, was partners with Mrs. Parker's grandfather. They founded this farm together over 80 years ago." Victoria, who was observing the class from afar, quickly approached. "What did you say?" Harold looked at her with sad eyes. "It's true, Mrs. Parker. My grandfather and yours founded this farm together. They were friends since they were young. They invested money and worked side by side. But they fought. Fought over what? Over pride. Your grandfather wanted to expand quickly, wanted to plant more than the land could give. My grandfather wanted to go slowly, respect the natural limits. They argued badly. And your grandfather bought my grandfather's share, paying less than it was worth. My grandfather became bitter. He taught that bitterness to my father, who taught it to me. But you never mentioned that. Because resentment is useless. My grandfather died bitter. My father died bitter. I didn't want to die like that too. When I started working here, I was young. Your husband gave me a chance, treated me well. I decided I wouldn't carry the weight of our grandfather's fight." Victoria sat on the ground right there, not minding the dirt. "All this history, the feuding families, and we just repeated the pattern. I treated you badly exactly like my grandfather treated yours. But we're breaking that pattern now." Harold extended his hand to her. "We're proving it's possible to overcome the past." Victoria took his hand and stood up. And there in front of the students, she hugged Harold. It was a sincere hug, filled with apologies, forgiveness, and a new beginning. "I'd like to make a formal request," Victoria said when they separated. "I want you to be a partner in this school, not an employee, a partner. We'll document everything properly. Your family deserves this justice." Harold was moved. That was more than money or position. It was recognition. It was historical justice being done. The school grew even more. With Harold as an official partner, they could access more resources, make more partnerships. The farm became a model not only regionally but nationally for the recovery of degraded properties and sustainable agriculture. But life had more surprises in store. Emily had met one of the visiting instructors who came to teach at the school. His name was Peter. He was 28 years old and he was Harold's son. Peter had studied biology and worked with environmental recovery. When Harold invited him to see the school, he was impressed with the work, and even more impressed with Emily. They started working together on projects to recover the still degraded areas of the farm. They spent hours discussing techniques, testing approaches, smiling at each other when something worked. Harold noticed, of course. He knew his son well enough to see he was falling in love. And Victoria noticed too, seeing how Emily became happier, more radiant. "They're a good match," Victoria commented to Harold one afternoon while watching Emily and Peter working together. "Yes, they are," Harold smiled, "but it's up to them." It didn't take long. Peter asked Emily to be his girlfriend during an especially beautiful sunset, with the whole farm golden in the evening light. She said yes, without hesitation. Victoria was happy, but also apprehensive. She talked to Emily the following night. "Honey, are you sure? You're still so young, you have your whole life ahead of you." "I'm sure, Mom. Peter is... It's like he was made for me. We think alike, we share the same values, the same dreams." "And Harold? Does he approve?" "He does. In fact, I think he's happier than both of us combined." And he really was. Harold saw in that relationship something beautiful and symbolic. After generations of distance, the families were uniting again, not out of interest or obligation, but genuine love. The wedding happened 2 years later, right at the farm. It was a simple but beautiful celebration. The restored areas served as a natural backdrop. Miss Betty and the other farmers prepared a feast with products all grown right there. The whole community was invited. During the ceremony, Harold and Victoria walked side by side to the small family cemetery where Dr. Richard was buried. "Richard," Victoria said softly, touching the headstone, "our daughter is getting married. To Harold's son, I think you'd approve. I think you're proud of how strong and wise she's become." Harold put his hand on her shoulder. "He is proud, I'm sure of it." With Emily and Peter's marriage, the farm's dynamics changed again. Peter brought new ideas, new projects. He wanted to expand the restoration work to other properties in the region, create a network of sustainable farms. Emily fully supported him. Together they developed a program where students from the school would go to other struggling farms and apply the techniques they'd learned. It was a form of practical internship that benefited everyone. Oak Ridge Farm became a hub. Farmers came from far away to visit, to learn, to get inspired. The story of its restoration gave hope to others in similar situations. Victoria, now 65 years old, continued working actively. But her role had changed. She wasn't in the fields every day anymore. Instead, she gave lectures. She told her story, hiding nothing, using her failures as lessons. "I destroyed this farm out of pride," she always began her talks. "I thought I knew more than everyone, that I didn't need to listen to anyone, and I almost lost everything because of it. What I'm here to say is, don't be like I was. Be like I'm trying to be now. Be humble. Be open. Be willing to learn from anyone, no matter their age, formal education, or social position." Her lectures always moved people. Seeing a woman of her standing admit mistakes so publicly, so viscerally touched people. Harold also gave lectures, but of a different kind. He talked about techniques, about ancestral knowledge, about the importance of preserving traditional wisdom. "My grandfather died a bitter man," he would tell, "but the knowledge he held was pure gold. It was generations of observing nature, of learning from the cycles, of respecting the land. If I had let my bitterness win, that knowledge would have died with me, but I chose to share it, and look what that created." Sundays at the farm became a tradition. Everyone gathered for a community lunch under the trees they had planted together. The table was laden with produce from their own land, fresh vegetables, ripe fruits, bread baked on the spot, homemade jams. Sometimes there were 20 people, sometimes 50. There was always room for one more. There was always enough food. It was a weekly celebration of everything they had achieved together. On one of these Sundays, 3 years after Emily and Peter's wedding, there was a special announcement. "We have some news," Emily said, standing next to her husband, a huge smile on her face. Victoria already knew. A mother always knows. She started crying even before the confirmation. "Am I going to be a grandmother?" she asked, her voice choked up. Yes, Mom. You're going to be a grandmother. The celebration was instant. Hugs, tears, laughter. Harold held his son tightly, whispering something in his ear that made Peter cry too. The baby was born 9 months later, a healthy boy with big, curious eyes. He was baptized Richard Samuel, honoring both his great-grandfather and his great-great-grandfather. When Victoria held her grandson for the first time, she thought about everything she had been through, about the poor choices she had made, the people she had hurt, the near loss of everything. And she thought about how she had been blessed with a second chance. You will grow up on a farm full of love, she whispered to the baby. You will learn to respect the land, to respect people, to be humble. You will learn from your grandmother's mistakes, but also from her victories. And you will know that no matter how far you fall, it's always possible to get back up again. Harold was beside her, watching with a smile. He will have a good life. He will have strong roots. Yes, Victoria agreed. Roots that come from two sides intertwined, supporting him, as it should have been from the beginning. The years kept passing. The school grew even more. They built dormitories for students from other regions, expanded the classrooms, created simple but functional laboratories. The farm that was almost lost was now a nationally recognized center of excellence. Victoria and Harold grew old together, not as boss and employee, but as partners and friends. They spent afternoons talking about plants, about techniques, about the school's future. They argued sometimes, but always with respect. Emily and Peter gradually took on more responsibilities. They modernized some processes, integrated more technology, always sustainable, but without ever losing the essence of what they did. When Richard was 5, he spent his days running through the fields with the same curiosity Emily had at his age. Harold, now with completely white hair, taught his great-grandson the same lessons he had taught the boy's mother. See that plant over there, Richard? Harold pointed to a young tree. I see, Grandpa Harold. It needs water and sun, but it also needs time. It's no use pulling on it to make it grow faster. We just take care of it and let it grow at its own pace. Like people, Grandpa? Harold smiled. Exactly like people, my grandson. Victoria watched from a distance, at peace with herself for the first time in many years. She had worked hard to earn that peace. She had apologized to every person she had hurt. She had strived to be better, day after day. She wasn't perfect. She still had moments of impatience. She still made mistakes sometimes. But now she was willing to recognize her mistakes quickly, to apologize, to do better. One afternoon, 10 years after that terrible day, when she had trampled Harold's seedlings, Victoria sought him out in the farm's front garden, the same garden where everything had started to fall apart. Harold, can you come with me for a moment? They walked to that exact spot. Victoria knelt on the ground, in the same place where Harold had knelt to pick up the destroyed seedlings. What are you doing, Mrs. Parker? I am remembering. You knelt here, picking up the plants I destroyed while everyone watched. It was meant to be your humiliation, but it was actually mine, because it showed everyone who I really was at that moment. That was many years ago. I know, but I need to thank you. Thank me? For not giving up on this land, for coming back when I needed you, for teaching me not just about plants, but about being human. Harold helped her up, his eyes glistening with tears. You did the hard work, Mrs. Parker. I just showed you the way. No, she shook her head. You did much more than that. You forgave when you had every right to hate me. You helped when you had every reason to rejoice in my downfall. You broke a cycle of bitterness that lasted for generations. They embraced there in that garden that was now full of life again. The English roses that Victoria had so wanted had bloomed, but beside them grew native plants, wildflowers, a perfect mix of elegance and simplicity. That evening, during the Sunday community dinner, Victoria stood up to make an announcement. Everyone, I want to say something important. Everyone fell silent, attentive. Many of you have been with me since the beginning of this journey. You saw my mistakes, my fall, my struggle to get back up, and you stood by my side even when I didn't deserve it. She looked around the table, seeing familiar and beloved faces. I spent so much of my life worried about appearances, about what people thought of me, about maintaining an image of strength and success, and that almost destroyed me. But you taught me that true strength comes from admitting weaknesses. That true success comes from helping others succeed too. Emily held her mother's hand, proud. This farm is no longer just mine. It never was just mine, really. It belongs to all of you too. To Harold, who saved it with knowledge. To Miss Betty and the other ladies who invested their savings. To every person who donated a weekend to work here. To you, who made this a real community. That's why, Victoria continued, Emily and I have decided to make a change. We are turning the school into a cooperative. All the regular instructors will have a share in the profits. Everyone will have a voice in decisions. This will be documented, legalized, done the right way. The announcement was met with surprise and emotion. Some people cried. Others applauded. Miss Betty stood up and hugged Victoria tightly. "You've really changed, girl," she said, using girl even though Victoria was 65. "I had good teachers," Victoria replied, looking at the elderly farmers who had taught her so much. The transformation into a cooperative brought even more energy to the project. People felt truly like owners of it, invested in its success. New ideas emerged, new projects. The school began to offer not just agriculture courses, but also sustainable cooking, crafts with natural materials, and eco-friendly house building. Harold was elected president of the cooperative in the first assembly. He accepted humbly, saying he would just be a guardian of the collective knowledge. During his tenure, they established a scholarship fund for young people from low-income families who wanted to study agriculture. The first recipient was a 16-year-old boy from a nearby rural community. He reminded Harold of himself in his youth, curious, dedicated, respectful of the land. Victoria also created her own project. She began visiting other farms in trouble, offering free consulting. She didn't go as an expert, but as someone who had fallen and gotten back up, who understood the desperation but also knew the path to recovery. "You don't have to repeat my mistakes," she told the proud farmers who refused to ask for help. "I've already made those mistakes for you. Learn from them." Her honest, non-judgmental approach resonated with many. She helped dozens of properties avoid the fate she had nearly faced, and at each one she left the message. Seek out Harold and the school if you need technical help. Build community. Don't try to do everything alone. The years passed, and the farm continued to thrive. Richard grew up and became an intelligent and sensitive boy, passionate about nature just like his parents and grandparents. He spent hours in the fields with Harold, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. When Richard was 10, Harold began passing on to him the notebooks of his grandfather Samuel. The same notebooks he had kept for so many years, which contained generations of wisdom. "These are yours now, Richard," Harold said, handing over the carefully preserved notebooks. "But Grandpa, they're yours." "No, they belong to the family, and you're as much family as I am. Take care of them, study them, and one day pass them on to your children." Richard hugged the notebooks to his chest as if they were the greatest treasure in the world. And in a way, they were. Victoria watched that scene from the porch, her eyes misty. She thought about how things had changed, how she had changed. The woman who had dismissed those notebooks as superstition now saw them for what they really were, a precious legacy. That year, the school completed 10 years. They organized a big celebration, inviting all former students. More than 300 people came. Each had a story to tell about how the school's teachings had changed their lives. One former student had saved the family farm from going bankrupt. Another had started a thriving organic products business. Several were teaching the techniques in their own communities, multiplying the knowledge. During the celebration, they paid a special tribute to Harold and Victoria. They were called to the makeshift stage in the garden. "These two," Emily began her speech, emotional, "represent everything this school teaches. Harold teaches us about knowledge, about respecting the land, about preserving ancestral wisdom, and Victoria teaches us about humility, about admitting mistakes, about it never being too late to change. Together," she continued, "they proved that it's possible to heal old wounds, that families separated for generations can reunite, that pride can be transformed into wisdom." Victoria and Harold embraced on stage under emotional applause. They were two elderly people now. Harold 72 and Victoria 75, but still full of life and purpose. It was during that celebration that something magical happened. It started to rain. A soft, gentle rain, the first in many months. People looked up, smiling, letting the rain wet their faces. "It's a sign," Miss Betty, now almost 90, said loudly. "The land is blessing us." And in a way it was. That rain marked the end of a drought cycle that had lasted years. The rains became regular again. The region began to recover, and many of the techniques they had learned at the Oak Ridge Farm School were fundamental in helping other properties make the most of that return of water. In the following years, Victoria and Harold became almost legendary figures in the region. Their story was told as an example of redemption, of overcoming, of cooperation. When Victoria was 78, she finally decided to write a book telling her story. Not a technical book about agriculture, but an honest memoir of her journey. She wrote about the pride that blinded her, about the cruelty with which she treated Harold, about almost losing everything. But she also wrote about the transformation, about forgiveness, about the community that saved her. The book was published by a small local publisher and became an unexpected success. Schools began using it in classes about ethics and responsibility. Discussion groups formed. Victoria started receiving letters from people all over the country, thanking her for her honesty. One letter in particular touched her deeply. It was from a 60-year-old woman who had just lost her farm to the bank. "Mrs. Parker," the letter said, "I read your book after losing everything. I was thinking about giving up on life. But your story showed me that losing everything can be the beginning of something new, not the end. I'm starting over, smaller, more humble, but with hope. Thank you for sharing your journey." Victoria cried reading that letter, and then she wrote back, inviting the woman to visit the farm to learn, to see that it really was possible to start again. Harold, inspired by Victoria's book, decided to finally organize his grandfather's notebooks into a publishable format. With Emily and Peter's help, he transformed those old records into a practical, sustainable agriculture manual. Harold's book was different from Victoria's. It was technical, detailed, full of diagrams and instructions. But it also had stories, memories of his grandfather, reflections on the relationship between humans and nature. The two books together became almost a series. People would buy one and then the other. Some said they should be read together, that they complemented each other. Victoria's emotional journey and Harold's practical knowledge. When Richard was 15, he announced he wanted to follow his grandparents' path and study agronomy. But with one difference, he also wanted to study education. He wanted to become a teacher, continuing the school's legacy. Victoria and Harold couldn't have been prouder. Seeing their great-grandson choosing that path confirmed the cycle had truly been broken. There was no more bitterness, only love for the land and a desire to share knowledge. The farm continued to be a center of learning and transformation. But more than that, it became a symbol that it's never too late to change, that forgiveness is possible, that community is stronger than individualism. On Sundays, the tradition of community lunch continued. Now there were often 100 people or more. The table grew enormous, stretched beneath the trees they had all planted together. Children ran among the plants, learning without knowing they were learning. Victoria and Harold always sat together at opposite ends of the long table. From a distance, they looked like the patriarch and matriarch of a large family, and in a way they were. "Do you regret anything?" Harold asked Victoria on one of these Sundays. "Everything I did to you? Yes, every day," she answered honestly, "but I'm also grateful for it." "Grateful?" "Because it broke me, and only broken could I be rebuilt the right way." Harold smiled. "You've become a wise woman, Mrs. Parker." "I had a good teacher." The sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink. The farm fields stretched around them, green and prosperous. Fruit trees heavy with produce, thriving vegetable gardens, healthy coffee plantations. It was a huge contrast to that dry, dead land from years ago. Emily came to sit between them, bringing Richard along. "Grandma, Grandpa Harold, Richard wants to ask something." The boy looked at the two elders with bright eyes. "Is it true you were enemies?" Victoria and Harold exchanged glances, sharing a smile. Enemies is a strong word, Harold replied. I'd say we were people who hadn't learned to work together yet. And now? Now we're family, Victoria said, putting her hand on Harold's shoulder. The best family anyone could have. Real family, Richard repeated, liking the words, even though we're not blood. Family is who chooses to stay, Harold explained, who works together, faces storms together, celebrates victories together. Blood has nothing to do with it. Richard nodded, processing that wisdom. Then he ran back to play with the other children, shouting something about planting trees. He'll be fine, Emily said, watching her son. He'll grow up knowing what really matters. Thanks to you both, she continued, looking at Victoria and Harold. You broke a cycle, created something new, something better. Victoria felt tears in her eyes again. She cried more easily now, with age. But they were good tears, of gratitude. It wasn't just us, she said. It was the whole community. Every person who helped us, who believed when there was no reason to believe. That's true, Harold agreed. Alone we wouldn't have accomplished anything. As night fell, people began lighting small fires around the area. It was another tradition that had emerged naturally, ending Sundays around the fire, telling stories, singing songs, simply being together. Victoria observed all of that and felt a deep peace. She had lived long enough to see complete redemption. Not just of herself, but of the farm, of relationships, of everything. When everyone had left and the night was completely dark, Victoria walked alone to the small family cemetery. She did this sometimes when she needed to think or feel a connection to the past. Richard, she said to her husband's headstone, I think I finally understood what you always tried to teach me, that the land is not ours to dominate, but to care for. That people are not tools, but partners. That pride is the root of all destruction. She touched the cold stone. It took me time, my love. I almost destroyed everything you built, but I think I fixed it. I think our legacy is safe now. And Harold, she continued, you always said he was special, that he had knowledge worth its weight in gold. You were right, as you always were. If you were here, you would be proud of how he and Emily transformed this place. Victoria stayed there for a few more minutes, in silence, just feeling the night wind. Then she returned home, where Emily and Peter were putting Richard to sleep. She went up to her room, tired but happy. Before sleeping, she looked out the window at the dark fields. Tomorrow would be another day of work, another day of teaching and learning, another day of building the future she had almost destroyed. But she was ready. She always would be, for the time she had left. The years continued their inexorable march. Harold turned 80 and remained active, though slower. He still taught classes, still spent time in the fields, but now with more breaks for rest. Victoria, at 83, had developed arthritis in her hands. The same hands that had worked so hard to rebuild the farm now ached with the cold and damp. But she didn't complain. She said it was a small price for all she had. Richard was at university now, studying agronomy and education as planned. He returned every weekend to help and learn more. It was already clear that he would be the one to carry the school forward in the next generation. It was on one of these weekends that something significant happened. An unexpected visitor arrived at the farm. It was a woman of about 50, well-dressed, driving an imported car. She got out and looked around with a confused expression. "Can I help you?" Emily approached. "I'm looking for Oak Ridge Farm. I was told it was here, but—" The woman hesitated. "Sorry, I think I'm in the wrong place. Oak Ridge Farm was a traditional coffee property. This looks more like a sustainable agriculture center," Emily completed with a smile. "This is Oak Ridge Farm. It just changed a bit over the years." The woman introduced herself as Claudia Johnson. She was the granddaughter of the Johnsons, the neighboring family Victoria had always tried to impress years ago. "My grandmother passed away recently," Claudia explained, "and among her things I found old letters from when she was friends with Mrs. Victoria Parker. I wanted to come, see how the farm was doing, perhaps speak with Mrs. Parker if she is still—" "She is alive and lives here," Emily said. "I'll get her." When Victoria appeared, leaning on a cane but still with an upright posture, Claudia was visibly moved. Mrs. Parker, I'm Claudia Johnson, Beatrice Johnson's granddaughter. Victoria seemed to travel back in time for a moment. Beatrice had been her best friend in their youth, before pride and social competition drove them apart. Beatrice, Victoria whispered. How was she? She was well, had a good life, but in the end she spoke of you often, of how you were friends, of how she missed that friendship. Claudia handed Victoria a yellowed envelope. She left this for you, said if I ever had the chance I should deliver it in person. Victoria opened the letter with trembling hands. It was Beatrice's handwriting, still firm despite her age. Victoria, my old friend, if you're reading this, then I've passed on before finding the courage to say what I need to say in person. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for distancing myself when you needed support after Richard's passing. I'm sorry for participating in gossip about your struggles. I was insecure and masked it with false superiority. I heard about your transformation, about the school, about how you changed your life. I felt proud, Victoria, proud of the courageous woman you became. I hope you can forgive me for not being the friend you deserved. With love and longing, Beatrice. Victoria cried while reading that letter. Another wound from the past being healed, even if too late to reciprocate in person. She was a good person, Victoria told Claudia. We were both young and foolish, concerned with the wrong things, but she was good at heart. Like you, Claudia replied. She always said that you had a good heart, you just needed to rediscover it. They talked for hours. Claudia told about her grandmother's life, about the Johnson farm that still existed but faced difficulties. Victoria told her own story, hiding nothing. If your family wants help, Victoria offered, we're here. The school can help, teach, guide. Claudia accepted. And so another connection was remade, another cycle was closed. That year, the school at Oak Ridge Farm received a National Sustainability Award. Emily and Peter went to Washington, D.C. to receive it on everyone's behalf. But they dedicated the award to Victoria and Harold. This award, Peter said in his acceptance speech, isn't just about farming techniques or business success. It's about human transformation. It's about two people who could have let bitterness and pride destroy everything, but chose another path. They chose humility, forgiveness, cooperation, and in doing so, they created something that benefits hundreds of people. When they returned, they held a special celebration. Victoria and Harold were honored with a plaque that would be placed at the school's entrance. Dr. Richard Parker Sustainable Agriculture Center, founded in humility, grown in cooperation, dedicated to the future. Victoria looked at that plaque and thought about how far she had come, from the woman who trampled plants and humiliated workers to the woman being honored for teaching humility and cooperation. Harold, she called him, and the two were alone for a moment. I want to thank you one last time. One last time? He asked with a smile. Are you going somewhere? Not today, she laughed, but we're getting old, don't know how much time we have left, so I want to say it now while I can. Thank you for everything, for saving my farm, my daughter, myself. Victoria, Harold called her by her first name, something he rarely did. You saved yourself. I just showed you it was possible. They embraced. Two elderly people who had lived long lives full of lessons. 2 more years passed. Richard graduated with honors and immediately returned to work at the school. He brought new energy, fresh ideas, but always respecting the essence of what his grandparents had created. Harold, now 82, began spending more time at home. His health was fragile, though his spirit remained strong. He spent afternoons reviewing his grandfather's notebooks with Richard, ensuring every detail, every piece of knowledge was passed forward. Don't let this get lost, boy, he'd say. This here is more valuable than any money. I won't let it, Grandpa, I promise. Victoria visited him almost every day. They would drink tea together, talk about the past, about the present, about plans for the future they might not see, but had helped plant. It was on one of these afternoons that Harold said something Victoria would never forget. You know, Victoria, I used to dream of the day you would apologize to me. In the first years after being fired, I fantasized about it. About you admitting you were wrong. About me having the satisfaction of seeing you humiliated. Victoria listened silently, without interrupting. But when it finally happened, Harold continued, it was nothing like I imagined. I felt no satisfaction. I felt sadness for all the lost time. And then I felt hope, because I saw that change was possible. If you could change, anyone could. You are a better man than I ever was a woman, Victoria said sincerely. No, Harold shook his head. You are just as good. You just needed to find it within yourself. And you did. The following spring, Harold passed away in his sleep, at peace. It was a shock, even though it was expected. The funeral was immense. Hundreds of people came to pay their last respects. Farmers he had helped, students he had taught, friends he had made over 82 years of a life well lived. Victoria was there, standing by the coffin despite her own physical difficulties. She placed a yellow rose on Harold's chest, the same flower she had destroyed so many years ago. Rest, my friend, she whispered. You left a beautiful legacy. During the months after Harold's passing, Victoria grew quieter. She still participated in the school, still gave her occasional lectures, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Emily worried. Mother, Harold would want you to stay strong. I know, daughter. I'm trying. It's just, he was my partner. We built all this together. Without him, it feels like a piece is missing. But the legacy continues. Look at Richard working so hard. Look at the school, growing. Look at how many lives have been changed. That is immortal. Victoria knew her daughter was right, and gradually she found peace again. She began writing a second part of her book, focusing on the recent years, on the teachings Harold had left behind, on the continuous transformation everyone could experience. When she turned 87, Victoria decided to do one last important thing. She called Emily, Peter, and Richard for a meeting. I want to formalize something, she announced. The farm and the school now belong entirely to the cooperative. I am transferring my share to the collective. I don't want it to be the private property of one family. I want it to belong to everyone who makes it happen. Mother, are you sure? Emily was surprised. This is our family's inheritance. And it will continue to be, but not as possession, as legacy. It's better to leave something that benefits many than something that enriches few. The process was done legally. Oak Ridge Farm officially became collective property, managed by the cooperative that included all teachers, staff, and contributing members. The news caused a sensation. It wasn't common to see someone give up ownership like that. But for those who knew Victoria's story, it made perfect sense. It was the final act of transformation, the last demonstration that she had truly changed. On the Sunday after the formalization, the community lunch was a celebration. Over 200 people attended. Victoria, frail but still lucid, sat in her usual chair and watched. There were 4 generations working together. There were people she had hurt in the past, now working side by side with her family. There were students from all over the country, spreading the knowledge they had learned there. There was a living, vibrant community, full of purpose. Grandma, Richard came to sit beside her. Are you okay? I'm great, my grandson. I'm just watching, recording everything in my memory. Why? Because one day I'll leave, just like Harold left, and I want to remember exactly this. How love can transform everything. Love? Yes. Love for the land, for the people, for knowledge. Harold taught me that without love, all technical knowledge is useless, and I hope you always remember that. Richard hugged his grandmother, feeling the fragility of her body but also the strength of her spirit. That was the last community lunch Mrs. Parker attended with full awareness. In the following weeks, her health declined rapidly. She spent most of her time in bed, but always with the window open so she could see the fields. Emily never left her side, and during the long night hours, the two finally had conversations they had postponed for decades. Daughter, Mrs. Parker said one of those nights, I'm so sorry for having been such a difficult mother. You were the mother you could be at that time, Mom, and then you became better. That's what matters. Your father would be proud of you. So proud. He would be proud of both of us, of how we fixed everything that was broken. Mrs. Parker smiled, her eyes closing slowly. I think I can rest now. I did what I needed to do. Not yet, Mom. There's still so much to see. Richard will marry soon, maybe have children. You could meet your great-grandchildren. Perhaps, Mrs. Parker whispered. If it's meant to be, it will be. But Mrs. Parker was right. A few days later, surrounded by family, she passed away peacefully. It was a peaceful farewell to a life that had been tumultuous, but, in the end, full of meaning. The funeral was as large as Harold's. People came from all over the country. Many cried, not just for the loss, but out of gratitude for having known that woman who had shown it's never too late to change. In the coffin, dressed in a simple dress she had chosen herself, Mrs. Parker looked at peace. In her hands, crossed over her chest, Emily placed a small seedling, not an expensive English rose, but a native species, simple, resilient. During the wake, Richard read excerpts from his grandmother's second book, still unpublished. They were words about forgiveness, about transformation, about legacy. I destroyed so much in my pride, one excerpt said, but I found that destruction can be the beginning of rebuilding. I learned that the hands that break can also plant, that the heart that hardens can soften again, that it's never too late to be better. Emily cried reading that. But they were tears of pride. Her mother had had a difficult journey, but she had completed it. She had started as a cruel and proud woman, and ended as an example of humility and love. Mrs. Parker was buried next to Richard in the small family cemetery. During the burial, the community sang traditional songs. Miss Betty, now 97 years old and still lucid, led the songs with her fragile but firm voice. After the burial, everyone returned to the farm for the community lunch. It was a tradition that wouldn't be broken even by death. The tables were set up, the food was served, and people gathered to remember. Every person there had a story about Mrs. Parker or Harold, about how they had been helped, taught, transformed. The stories intertwined, creating a rich tapestry of memories and gratitude. Richard, now 23 years old and taking on more responsibilities at the school, stood up to speak. My grandmother and Grandpa Harold taught me something fundamental, he began. They showed me that our life isn't defined by our worst moments, but by what we do after them. Grandma Victoria had terrible moments, did cruel things, but she didn't let that define who she was. She chose to change. And by doing so, she changed everyone around her too. He looked at the surrounding fields, green and prosperous. This land almost died. It was poisoned, mistreated, abandoned, but it was saved. Not only was it saved, it was transformed into something even better than it was before. And this was only possible because people decided to work together. Without pride, without fear of admitting they needed help, Emily joined her son. We will continue the work, she promised. We will keep the school running. We will expand knowledge. We will honor the legacy my mother and Harold left behind, not out of obligation, but out of love. In the months that followed, the school underwent changes. Richard implemented new ideas, always respecting the essence of what had been created. He started an exchange program, bringing students from other regions of the US, and even from other countries. Victoria's second book was published posthumously and became even more popular than the first. High schools began using it in ethics and citizenship classes. Her story became a case study in personal transformation and social responsibility. 2 years after Victoria's death, Richard got married. The ceremony was at the farm, of course. During the vows, he mentioned his grandparents. I promise to be a husband who knows how to admit when he is wrong, like my grandmother learned to do. I promise to be a partner who works together, like my grandfather Harold always was. I promise to build our future with humility and love. His bride, an agronomist he had met at the school, made similar promises. They knew they were carrying an important legacy. 1 year after the marriage, the couple's first child was born, a girl who was named Victoria Samantha, honoring both her great-grandmother and her great-great-grandfather. When Emily held her great-granddaughter for the first time, she thought of her mother and of Harold. She thought of everything they had lived through, of all the difficulties they had overcome, of all the love they had spread. "Welcome, little Victoria," she whispered to the baby. "You were born in a special place, built on forgiveness, fueled by cooperation, dedicated to the future. You will have so many stories to learn." The farm continued to prosper. With each passing year, more people were touched by the work developed there. More properties were saved, more knowledge was shared, more lives were transformed. And at every Sunday lunch, when the community gathered, there was always a moment of silence, a moment to remember those who had started it all, Victoria and Harold, two imperfect people who had created something perfect in its imperfection. Their photos hung at the entrance to the school, not photos from when they were young and handsome, but photos from when they were old, working together in the fields. Photos that showed calloused hands, faces marked by the sun, genuine smiles of those who had found purpose. Underneath the photos, a plaque read, "Victoria Parker and Harold Wilson. They planted humility, reaped wisdom, and left love as their legacy." And everyone who passed by, new students, curious visitors, old friends, would stop for a moment. They read those words, they looked at those photos, and they understood that something special had happened there. Because in the end, it wasn't about agriculture, it wasn't about techniques or productivity, it was about human beings learning to be better, about pride being transformed into humility, about individualism being replaced by community, about how, even when we think it's too late, there is always time to start over. Oak Ridge Farm became legendary, not for what it produced, but for what it represented. Living proof that poisoned land can be healed, that destroyed relationships can be rebuilt, that people can change, truly change, if they have the courage and humility for it. And as the sun set over the green fields, as the wind blew through the trees that Victoria and Harold had planted together, as children laughed and played on the land that had almost died, the farm continued its quiet work, teaching, transforming, healing, proving every day that humility rebuilds what pride destroyed. The end. Now tell us what you thought of this story. Do you believe Victoria made the right decision by asking for help? What lesson do you take from this journey of transformation? Share your opinion in the comments with your sincere words. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one. Thank you very much for your company.